Just to simplify everything, could you please condense your arguments in 30 seconds? I know it's a challenge, but try to condense your argument into 30 seconds and answer a few simple questions. First, is the hegemonic transition happening? If so, who are the actors? And if there's no hegemonic transition, why? Just like in 30 seconds or 1 minute. I know it's a challenge, but then I just want to ask you to really condense your idea to a very simple argument so we can have something to debate on, come up with a thesis.
First of all, I think the question whether there's a hegemonic transition going on, I think that's the wrong question to ask in the first place. But if I were to answer this question, I would say no, because you have to define what does a hegemonic transition mean. So if a hegemonic transition means a nation state, I mean a country in the form of a nation state, eventually going to replace the current recognizable hegemonic power, if that is the mechanism you're describing as the hegemonic transition, then the answer is no. And that answers the question. So who are the players? If we're thinking that the key players remain the state actors, the traditional conventional IR, which plays states as the primary actor or the level of analysis, right? But I think as John suggested in his presentation, the non-state actors are playing increasingly important role in the whole processes. So that we have to address that aspect as well. So in a nutshell, my response is, so to summarize my key points is the idea of re-emergence is bad. Okay, full stop.
And John, now can you try 30 seconds or 1 minute?
Okay, 30 seconds or 1 minute. That is quite challenging. But yeah, I would put it like this: the politically correct answer, right? No, but it depends. And that is basically the message of my talk as well. It depends. From a state-centric realist perspective, we can make internally valid claims of emerging bipolarity or emerging multipolarity, and that would amount to some kind of emerging hegemonic transition, perhaps. These are claims that well-known scholars from representing those perspectives also make. If we make use of other poor measures, the ones that I mentioned in the beginning, the power transition has already occurred. But those measures, I think, are not relevant. But if we apply another perspective, a world society perspective, and zoom in on other actors, we will see that the U.S. network centrality in world society networks is very pronounced, and that we have a global networks in world society and a vast amount of different type of non-state actors that are all based in or depending on some kind of U.S. Infrastructure or a part of a U.S.-centered infrastructure or networks. So it depends. The state perspective, perhaps yes. From an international system perspective, perhaps yes. But from a world society perspective, I would say no. U.S. dominance is really pronounced, I would say.
Thank you. And Karl, can you try?
Right.
You can do 30 seconds. You'll win the prize.
Okay. In terms of hegemonic transition, it depends on what kind of transition, what level of transition we're talking about. If we're really talking about at the state level, right, and thinking about the rise of China means the fall of the U.S., I think that's going to happen. It may not be the rise of China, but the fall of the U.S. is evident, in my opinion. But if we're talking about more at the system level, the rules of game, liberal international order, open, rule-based multilateralism, I don't think that's going to change. And even if we talk about the elephant or panda in the room, and Chinese actors, non-state actors, private business actors, state-owned enterprises or private enterprises, or even some state institutions, they're still bound by rules of the international order, and they still behave in the ways that are prescribed by the World Trade Organization or even multilateral institutions. So no, I don't think at the system level it's going to change.
So the impressions that I get from the responses is that it depends really, right? There's no simple answer. So let's move to the next part. Then I have a few questions regarding the concept you use. So first, to Anya, right? You mentioned backward looking and forward looking. What do you mean exactly? And for John, you mentioned about the American Tianxia. What does that mean? And Karl, you mentioned about actor, structure, and system. What are the differences among them?
Theoretical level, I conceptualize forward-looking, and so I use the two terms, right? Forward-looking versus backward-looking. I'm referring to the temporal orientation of the self-construction, of the construction of self. And I operationalize these two concepts in the context of national identity construction. So backward-looking, in the case of China, I mean, you have to think of China, always use the past as an anchor to use the past to construct the present and future identity. So in a nutshell, they use the past as an anchor. So always looking back, always use the past as a point of reference for the making of the present and the future identity. In a nutshell, forward-looking is the opposite mechanism that doesn't use the past as a point of reference, like as an anchor for the construction of its identity. Simple. Sorry.
So before we get to John, I like to push you a little bit on the forward-looking and backward-looking. What if someone actually argue that China is forward-looking in terms of its practice, right? When you look at its economic, its policy. Although it used the past to mobilize the past cultural memories to legitimize certain practices. However, right, but when you look at the actual practice, China, it's actually forward-looking.
So that's why that's why I don't define forward-looking that way. I'm saying the construction of the self. I'm talking about the narrative, the stories, the state construct. I'm not interested in examining the empirical practice at a practice level. So I define my concept very clearly. I make sure what it is and what is not.
You mean at the state level?
What do I mean by state level? So I investigate the state-produced narratives. So a variety of sources I sampled for my analysis, which includes political speeches by politicians, the top leaders of the state, and government reports. So for instance, the National Strategy Report or diplomatic blue books in the case of Japan. I also surveyed high school history textbooks and also examined so if there is IR school, the IR theories developed within the nation, within the countries. For instance, the Chinese school of IR, right? For instance, I also look at how the native scholars develop their own theories of international relations. And I also use scholarly works as a supplement in case to improve the rigorous of my the robustness of my because I do the coding myself, right? So in a sense to increase the intercoding reliability.
Okay. Yeah. So you mean it's more at the central government level? You look at the narratives.
Well, I don't just look at the central government because the history textbooks are not the sole product of the central government. Certainly not in the case of more democratic societies. In the case of the U.S. and Japan, in China, yeah, of course, the narratives are more coherent, and so it's not entirely about the central government because I don't study China alone. China is one of my case studies. It's not the only case I look at.
But are there variations among different state actors?
Yes. Sorry, what do you mean by variations? So state society variations are interstate.
For example, maybe a local government in Zhejiang, let's say, it's forward-looking, while maybe in a central government, maybe they could be backward.
Right. That is your that is a hypothesis. So do you have concrete evidence to prove that, say, the county cadre in Zhejiang produce a counter-hegemonic narrative. If you have an example, good, I would like to see it. Do you have it?
So, because I read a lot of comparative politics, right? Comparative politics always present the counter evidence to the IR. So it seems like there's an ongoing battle between this, two sub-disciplines in political science. So it depends on how you look at it, whether at the national level, regional level, or the local level.
Well, let me just jump in a little bit here. If we're talking about international transition, and obviously there are different actors that are in China, at least, that are international actors. For example, provinces can be international actors, even localities can be international actors. But I think in terms of driving home that central key message about where China should be in the world and how China should position itself, I think at least at the national and subnational level, there's a if not a consensus, a factual consensus, there was at least a superficial or consensus prima facie that is a political historical nostalgia towards China was like Anya said, the great rejuvenation of Chinese nation was so great in the past. So I still kind of understand the backward looking is really anchored in that part, selectively chosen part of the Chinese history, where China is peaceful, could be, where China had a great presence, where China was center of the world, and that in effect we're moving towards that past. So I guess in that way there was a consensus, even though that provinces can be, I'm not sure if they are, but even though they can be forward-looking, but in effect they're trying to draw legitimacy of their actions by referencing to where they were or China were in the past.
And John, any quick thought on that?
Not in relation to that specifically, no.
Then let's get to your American Tianxia concept. What do you mean? I mean, the Tianxia concept, right, was developed by Yang and other philosophers and IR theorists. So, but then, what's his name? Bobonis, right? He kind of took the idea of Tianxia and then turned it around, and he argues American Tianxia. What does that mean?
Well, it's American Tianxia is not really a concept that I am using, to be honest. It was more like a side note relating to the world society perspective. So it's not really a concept that I have used or developed at all, actually.
And then what? It's a world society then?
Yeah, we can look at Tianxia as some kind of what it means, like all under heaven, or some kind of spiritual community, or some kind of universal rule where the United States is at the center. And we also have other scholars. I think Kong, he wrote an article. If it was not about American Tianxia, it was the American tributary system, I think he called this article, where we can see some of the Chinese concept in terms of centrality, some kind of moral community, all under heaven, applying to the United States today from this perspective. But it's not really my concept that I developed. It's other scholars who have used it. It was more like a side note. World society is different. That is the concept that I was using. That relates to it's an English school concept actually, but it's also a concept that is used by the Stanford School. But in terms of the English school notion, it is a concept that refers to humanity as a whole. It has an individualist ontology, focuses on individuals or non-state actors and humanity as a whole. And yeah, depending on how you theorize it, it has been theorized differently. It can be very normative, engaging normative theories, but you can also have a more empirical look where you focus on global networks and how they interact and form some kind of world society.
So you just mentioned about empirical research, right? So can you give us like maybe one or two examples of the concrete actors who are part of the world society?
As I mentioned in my talk, you can look at global production networks, global value chains as one specific global network, corporate networks, and various individuals from all over the world occupy different positions in this network. Various corporate entities or subsidiaries occupy different positions in this network. Various nodes in these networks are located in different countries, but the scale is global. That's one aspect or one example. Transnational corporations, global production networks. But we can also look at it in terms of social media actors or individuals that engage in online networks as individuals participating on this vast deterritorial domain of the internet. There we also see world society networks. And we can exemplify this in terms of ideological networks such as the Me Too movement and others. These concepts, these actors cannot be grasped by traditional state-centric concepts or actorhood that centers on the state only.
So now, like, I will ask you to spend a moment to reflect on each other's, arguments, and see, whether your arguments can somewhat converge or they are actually incommensurable, right? Like is there like a synergy that we can make from this three different perspective into a more holistic understanding of power transition, or I mean, you don't like the term, right? Power transition. Let's say understand the dynamic in the world order or the world production system. So just take a moment to really think about it, see if we can actually mix in a way, this three competing perspective.
I don't know if they merge really. I mean, we have very different presentations, but I think other points that were raised were really interesting, and just some basic thoughts or questions. But perhaps we could come up with some kind of synthesis. But in terms of Anya's presentation, if I understand correctly, then re-emergence of a civilization is a flawed idea or not possible. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So China is, if China tries to rise as a civilization, it is pointless.
That sounds pathetic, but yeah.
Yeah. But China is not rising as a civilization. China is rising as a nation.
Is China just a nation? But can you say China is a nation? Can you separate China as a nation and China as a civilization? Is that possible?
I would say so, yes. I would say you can look at China that as an entity or as a state that is rising as a nation, not necessarily as a civilization.
But it's a civilization for you, Anya. Maybe that can help to clarify this question. Well, it's a nation.
Right. I think that's a good point, because when I was using the term civilization, I was trying to be very careful, because the concept of civilization is a modern construct, right? It didn't really appear until the 18th century. So if you do a genealogy of concepts, so if you look at the concept of histories, basically all the terms that we use nowadays, including the term nations, ethnicity, culture, civilization, all of these terms, these concepts, did not really emerge before Enlightenment, basically. So now when we do use these words, as if like as if they have existed eternally, like forever there. We have to be really careful with the power dynamics behind the invention of those terms, right? So we have to, in a sense, disintegrate and unpack the meanings attached to those concepts. So go back to your question, Alvin, that what do I mean by a civilization? I don't define it. No historians ever really, there isn't a consensus or a fixed definition for what, the ontology of this concept, what a civilization is. But rather, I presented in the table of my slide, to give you a brief idea of what I presented early on, was that states So when we say China, when we do use the term China, we invoke so many meanings, right? We can say China. So if I have this idea of China, so where does China start? So if you talk about China, that China is a country with 5,000 years of history, right? That notion just jumped into our mind immediately. But is this understanding correct? So when we do really use the word, like just I said, ask John, is it possible to even split China as distinctively as a nation state and as a civilization? I mean, of course, that binary itself is artificial creation, right? Creation. But just to let you know, there's just so many dimensions that that constitute the country. So a country. So the temporal boundaries that make the shape the nation is what I focus in my story, in my narrative. Sorry, so Alvin, your question is like, what is a civilization? Is China a civilization, right? That is your question, right?
That's my question. John, look like you have something to add.
I can understand I understand Anya's argument in terms of how she expressed the pointlessness or somehow the flaw or the error in trying to.
Well, I think I'm not really talking about the pointlessness or the flawed idea. I'm just saying that that's why I use the term fragility. So we tend to think a civilization, I mean, a country can be fragile, right? A country decline, the rise again, right? So we tend to think a state, like a government, a dynasty. But civilization is something that's enduring, that's lasting forever.
Yeah.
But I think
no, I don't think there is anything problematic or contradictory in China rising as a nation. I think it's quite expected.
Well, if China, materially, yes, it is on a rising trajectory. I'm not denying that aspect.
Yeah, maybe because we are focusing on different aspects. Maybe
exactly.
I'm zooming in on more material factors, and you might zoom in on more ideational factors.
Yeah. So, Karl, you mentioned about both factors, right? Ideational and also material. So, you think that your framework can kind of integrate both of John's and Anya's arguments?
Well, I guess. Well, I certainly didn't think about backward or forward looking in a way, but in terms of the civilization argument that Anya evoked, it certainly is. I guess it is part of that narrative, or part of that story that concerns the Japan's rise in late 19th century, and I think and if to use John's term, structural power, and I don't and the catchphrase American Tianxia, I think in that sense, and go back to your old question, is power transition going on? I don't think that is, but I guess the framework that kind of separates material power versus ideation power or even normative power, it has room. It certainly has room to integrate both Anne's and John's argument, and actually enriches some of the stories that could be told. I think yes. So I mentioned the civilization aspect and the structural power aspect. So those two are certainly aspects that can be digged even further and just simply looking and to compare what we can draw from the experience of the rise of Japan in the late 19th century.
So my impression is a bit like this understanding of civilizations and culture. They kind of entangle. I want to kind of disentangle a little bit. So I want to ask the speakers, right, to actually distinguish civilization and a culture.
Well, if I can say something perhaps, because Erik Ringmar released a book recently called, I think, a non-European perspective on international relations or something like that, or I think that was the title. I'm not entirely sure, where he made an explicit distinction between culture and civilization. According to Erik Ringmar, culture is sedentary, whereas civilization is nomadic. or about exchange. Culture is about building walls around your territory, around your plot, around your nation, whereas civilization thrives on exchange, on trade, on transcending borders. So he distinguished culture and civilization in terms of sedentary and nomadic perspectives. Yeah, that is just one perspective on those two concepts that you actually mentioned.
If you consider China as a civilization, right, or as a cultural entity.
Sorry, Alvin, I'm not saying China is a civilization. I'm saying China's narrative portrays China as a civilization.
Civilization cannot re-emerge. I think that's what she means. It's not the narrative cannot re-emerge. It's that civilization, because it's backward looking, it cannot re-emerge. I think that's a core, right?
Why it cannot re-emerge? I don't get it.
Because it contradicts the temporality of modernity, which
and
is
that's
forward-looking.
Then that's a kind of a linear way of understanding, right? If you look at
but this linear understanding of time dominates our modern understanding. We can't think outside this box, can we?
No, I think you're totally correct here, Anya. I totally agree with that. I mean, the linearity of modernity, that is the temporality of modernity is linear. It is progressive. It is forward-looking. It looks at society as moving through different stages. So we can even look at it in terms of Rostow's model of economic development, from traditional society, pre-conditions to or pre-takeoff stage, and then takeoff stage, and then at the very end, the stage of high mass consumption. We have the same thing in terms of viewing countries in different stages, actually in Marxism as well. So we go through various modes of production. So we have slavery, then feudalism, then capitalism, and then communism. We have other modern theories. I mean, Francis Fukuyama's whole claim is that there is like a happy end state, end of history, where eventually and hopefully all states will eventually converge. So I mean, theories of modernization and modernity explicitly has this linear temporality. So it totally contradicts. I totally agree with that argument. So I don't see anything that is strange there, Alvin.
Yeah, maybe I'm influenced by the multiple modernities literature and also evolution theory. I think it can go to different trajectories, right? It can also revert back to the primitive society. Just think about
sure. Anthropologists have written tons of books on multiple temporalities, and I'm aware of that body of literature. Not saying there isn't a resistance. Of course, there's a power of this resistance. There's always various forms of counter-hegemonic understandings and narratives out there. But I'm just focusing on how this narrative of re-emergence, aspiration of re-emergence, could be it could be tragic, something really tragic that it's not possible. And then how it's relevant to the future world order, because that is in my last chapter of my dissertation. So I talked about how of course I define what do I mean by order, and I define what do I mean by the politics of aspiration. So Marshall Finemore has recently written an article. I think it's called "The Politics of Aspiration." So I refer to that particular article a lot. And in terms of the word order, so I take a post-constructivist approach, and the book written by James Bailey Martin. So her work, I think, so the book
ordering international politics.
Yes, ordering international politics. So I basically building on her sociolinguistic understanding of word order, and because I examine narrative, so that an identity, so I see how it fit into her theorization of order. And I think if you have this aspiration of restoration, the restoration of Chinese great Chinese nation, of course, there is this civilizational cultural dimension comes in inevitably. And does this idea of, you know, making Chinese culture or Chinese civilization something appealing to the rest of the world, for the rest of the world to imitate, to emulate, do you think that's a viable option? So I basically examine that aspect, and I think my answer is no. That's the story that China is trying to sell to the world is basically not appealing. It's simply not appealing as American, you know, the idea of liberalism and freedom and all that, which is part of the civilization created by the Western you know, powers since the 16th century.
To just refer back to some of the concepts that I mentioned, I think the China as a case, or the China story or China's example, I think it can be appealing to actors in international society, to other states, other leaders, but I don't think it is appealing to world society actors, individuals, non-state actors. NGOs, corporations, universities. Universities, they love to engage in exchange with Chinese universities. So maybe there I'm wrong. But yeah, so I think you're right in terms of a world society perspective. The global individual, so to speak, might not be so attracted to China's example. But international society actors, other state leaders, they might actually see and look to China as an example. And I think there are many states that actually look up to China as an example, and China is beginning to perform more of a teacher role, a leadership role or a teaching role, where they can teach other countries how to develop.
Yeah. And may I ask you, John, which literature are you referring to? That the teacher role that China is seen by some other states, like say Turkey, Erdogan may perceive Xi Jinping as, you know, with concentration power, right? So that's something.
Yeah, I was referring to some of the work that I've written myself, actually, but I wrote an article recently about that I termed China as exemplar. Justin Lin, New Structural Economics, and the China model in Ethiopia, I think I called it.
So there's a lot of China and Africa literature that looks at how either African delegates or African delegations are formally trained by Chinese universities on governance or on some more technicalities from either through bilateral agreements or something. I think, and I remember, don't know who wrote that, but I think it's Chen Yunnan from Boston, or John Hopkins. That she studied a very little bit in her Ethiopian railway case, that there are formal bilateral training, where the Ethiopians sent delegations to China to learn about to learn about technologies and governance.
Yeah, and party-to-party exchanges.
Yeah, exactly.
And so on.
Yeah. Wen Yao does a lot of that party-to-party stuff.
Yeah. So I think that distinction, I mean, when we make that distinction, international society and world society distinction, at least in my mind, I like it at least, then we can actually zoom in on different type of actors, and it will make the China case very different, if it's rising or not, or it's if it is attractive or not.
We are in the midst of a pandemic, right? But looking towards the post-COVID-19 world, I really hope this pandemic will be over soon. I feel, it's been stuck here for forever. What do you see the world will be? I mean, in terms of world order, will you see any drastic change, or a rupture, or just business as usual? Looking towards the post-COVID-19 world.
Business as usual.
You optimistic, or are you more pessimistic, or you just don't care? You're neutral.
So one of my current projects is examines. So I look at how humans are different from artificial intelligence. So I think there's a conventional argument examining, saying, we should be careful of artificial intelligence because the AI is becoming more like humans. I think, in my opinion, it's really the other way around. I think it's not really AI becoming more human. It's basically like humans, we are becoming more AI, like we are being programmed. So in the sense that we start to function more and more like artificial intelligence. So this is like the human aspects starting losing. It's like dropping out from our body and mind. So that really concerns me. So in a sense, I would want to go back in time, like if I can do time traveling. So I'm a person who is against backward looking, but in that aspect, right, I think it's good to be a little bit to retain this primitive aspects in like the human nature. So I'm more concerned about like the preservation of human nature, and another concern I have is climate change, so global warming and all those environmental issues. So I think this is one good positive. I mean, of course, the pandemic as a whole is damaging, but there's one positive side is the reduction of pollution, and people start thinking, how human beings have caused too much damage for the world, and we see more animals running around. Yeah, so I guess we are more reflexive. We'll become more reflexive, and hopefully we can work on some of the issues, more pressing issues like climate change.
And how about John and Karl? Are you optimistic, pessimistic, or are you just uncertain?
Well, predictions are always very hard, especially when they are about the future.
That's what IR should do, right? IR needs some predictive, power, right?
Yeah. I don't know. I tend to be having the sound realist skepticism in terms of looking at the world. Not very optimistic, to be honest. More skeptical. I don't know if I would call it pessimistic, but yeah, I tend to see the world more in terms of tragedy than romance. I'm quite concerned about the future. The lockdowns have very devastating effects on the mental health, on the health situation, on schooling, on literacy, on all kinds of consequences and effects that come from lockdown policies, trying to prevent the spread of corona. So I'm quite pessimistic. I think those consequences are really severe. It will affect the livelihoods of millions of people, income and wealth of millions of people. And I also am quite concerned about the way of life that we're living now, very atomistic, isolated selves, loss of community and human interaction, and the digital life is, I don't know, it's not my cup of tea.
Well, I think it's probably business as usual.
I didn't hear it.
Business as usual.
Yeah, business as usual, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting. In some sense, we see quite strict state-centric or nationalist or protectionist policies on the one hand, but on the other hand, we see a lot of global cooperation in world society between various researchers, various corporations that are trying to find or developing vaccines, corporations trying to capitalize on selling vaccines and so on. We see tremendous exchange on Zoom between scholars, professionals, academics, universities, in a way that has been really, I would say, amplified in a total, in a new way. So you have contradictions. One, you have contradictions in the sense that we are going towards, we're going in different directions at the same time, which is quite interesting.
My impression is that three of you are not very excited about the upcoming digital world, the AI world. Whereas like I attended some business meeting, right? People are very upbeat about that, the upcoming of AI robots, or this automation. Like the business community, right? At least those like tech people, they think it will be a totally different world.
Yeah,
I mean, where the money is, though. They speak of it that way.
So AI will be a game changer. Maybe the current world order will be changed by technology, right? Will be changed by algorithm.
You know, I think it goes back to different perspectives, right? We as individuals, we as communities might have different sentiments, different outlooks. Some might be much more pessimistic than others. Others might be very optimistic. Just like I described before, it's not this type of life that I'm living now during the pandemic is not really my cup of tea. And I think the side effects of the various lockdowns are costing much more than they need to. So that is just my perspective. I mean, this digital age and digital corporations and so on. You mentioned tech and so on. That's an extremely unequal world. The digital divide is tremendous. It's extreme, rampant inequality. And at the same time, we are worshiping entrepreneurs like Bezos and Elon Musk like they are gods. It's not really a world that I find attractive.
I would like to thank Anya and John and Karl for participating in this debate.